Welcome to the 775 Alive podcast, your rural Nevada headquarters for decoding politics, economics, and general global shenanigans. I'm Crystal Newton, your business strategist, breaking down why Nevada's hustle is stronger than a sagebrush root in a windstorm. Here with my trusty co-host, Scott Gaborski, PhD historian, here to explain the smart lessons of history, even if we are likely to ignore them. Grab your boots for a wild ride through today's most important news.
Okay, welcome back here to 775 Alive, and of course it's the country's birthday week here, the 250th anniversary, which is why Crystal there has her Christmas tree all done up in the red, white, and blue. And we've been having, like I think most of the country has, a series of discussions about where we are as a country at 250, what the meaning of the Declaration of Independence was. Crystal's been teasing me, asking me a bunch of trivia questions, and I think you have a couple more you wanted to throw in my direction that we thought it might be fun to start the episode with.
I do. I consider myself a very patriotic American, but doing research for this episode, I've learned quite a bit. It's much more substantial and meaningful to me, just what it means that our country exists at all. But I do want to ask you a few questions. I know that we declared independence on 1776. Do you know when the 4th of July was considered a federal holiday? What first year?
Well, let's see. I know they celebrated it in 1777 with a bunch of gunfire salutes. I'm almost going to say it really did become a federal holiday until some point in the 19th century. This is Stump the Historian for folks.
Totally. Yeah. First paid holiday, 1938.
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. I see. It was celebrated well before that, but yeah, it was
You would have thought that would have been the first holiday.
Well, but I think there's a structural issue. You're not taking into account that FDR and the New Deal were really enamored of these bank holidays that they have in Britain and instituted those in the 1930s.
Yeah.
But the holiday itself had been well celebrated beforehand.
Yeah. Do you know how many days it took Thomas Jefferson to write the Declaration of Independence?
Like 2.5 weeks or something like that.
Yeah, 17 days.
It was very quick. And of course, he cribs everything from Locke and to a lesser extent Baron de Montesquieu, the spirit of the laws.
Yeah, that was one of the things that surprised me was a lot of the things came from things that already existed in Britain. It's almost like we're like, we'll take most of it except for the king.
There's a whole detailed story. And of course, I taught this for years when I was teaching at the college. But yeah, I mean, a lot of the stuff that's actually embedded in the Declaration of Independence goes back to a lot of British history of the previous century, of the 17th century, and the struggles that lead up to the English Civil War in 1640s, and then the Glorious Revolution of 1688. So,
yeah. Okay.
Next question.
What was the name of the king that we broke away from? Yep. Let's see. What else do we have here? When was Thomas Paine's Common Sense published?
1774, I believe.
Almost. I was surprised by this. It was 1776.
Oh, much later. Okay.
Months before we were like, yeah, we need to leave these people. That was pretty quick. That was a pretty quick turnaround.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, of course, Paine gets involved in the French Revolution at the end and becomes problematic.
Here's one for you. What was the population of the United States in 1776?
The population? Geez, this guy writes on demographics. I'm not sure I know. Maybe 5 million, if that?
No, it's 2.5 million.
Okay, so I doubled.
There were less people in America than there were that populate the state of Nevada.
Mm-hmm.
Fighting off the imperial force.
Right, which of course is, 3,000, 3,500?
Yeah. Okay, so the most important question, I think, in this day and age to ask, what was eliminated from the Declaration of Independence when Congress reviewed it? So, second to last question, how many signers were on the Declaration of Independence?
34, maybe?
There's 56.
Oh, wow. Okay, yeah.
They ranged in age from 26 to 70.
Mm-hmm. Franklin was 70, right?
Yeah, Franklin was 70. He was the oldest.
Mm-hmm.
So the last question, and this one's really contentious in this day and age. What part was eliminated from the Declaration of Independence between Jefferson finishing it and Congress approving it?
Slavery? Yeah, there
Yeah.
was a big contentious debate about whether slavery should be included. Not just the institution, but even the word, right?
Yeah. Yeah, Jefferson actually wrote it in to the Declaration of Independence that they were going to be a country without slavery. And the Congress, I think there was a few representatives from South Carolina that said we need it economically, and that wound up being the sticking point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Right. Very much like the Constitution 13 years later,
yeah,
11 years later, when the Constitutional Convention takes place in 1787. So,
yeah. So 76 to 65, we took 90 years of fighting over that.
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. And that might be a good place to get into this because I think, from my view, is of course, we're going through celebrations and looking at the Declaration of Independence. And remember, when it's signed, the U.S. and Britain have already been at war for all practical intents and purposes for 15 months, right? April 1775's Lexington and Concord. Um, and, at that point, it's still sort of a rebellion. There's still these hopes that they can resolve these issues. But the Declaration of Independence makes that sharp break. But I think one of the things a lot of people tend to forget, at least from my view, is that, independence was only the first step,
Mhm.
right? And they talk a lot about, okay, now we need to, there's that famous line that, if governments are no longer pursuing the ends we want them to pursue, right, that men can institute new governments to affect their safety and safety and health or whatever. But that is, this was actually, I think, very self-consciously taking a step. It's not just becoming independent, but they realized, I think, that they're setting themselves up to build this government, which the Constitution, the preamble later refers to the more perfect union.
Mhm.
Um, and I think if there's anything that really should be underlying this a bit more on the celebrations and is this fact that that's an uncompleted process. It's not just a celebration at a moment of independence, but sort of, I think, should be a recommemoration of that this is a work in progress, if one will, as a nation.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. And I think the biggest thing when it comes to America becoming a country was I think up until then, your rights as a person came from your ruler, a human being that decided the winners and losers. And America was really founded on this, like we determine our own destiny and future, and we take responsibility for it. And it's still something that we fight today. And it is something you always have to perfect, right? Whoever masters themselves. So it's always a continual process and it's never going to be perfect, but working towards that perfection is really what binds us and gives us our culture, I think.
Yeah, and I think there is something to that of being first. Of course, one of the things that's always struck me as interesting in talking about this, and most of viewers know I'm a historian of France by training, so these comparisons between the American Revolution and the French Revolution are sort of par for the course. But one of the things that struck me is that the word revolution actually has two diametrically opposed meanings in the English language. One
Mhm.
is that meaning of sort of, the earth revolves around the sun. It makes one revolution in 1 year of
Right.
returning to a starting point, which was the original meaning. And then because of primarily the French Revolution, but partially also the American, what we now call the American Revolution, it takes on that meaning of a sharp break, particularly when we talk about politics, right?
Mhm.
And what's interesting is one of the things that's always been problematic, and I think looking at the American Revolution and what it means, is how big of a sharp break are they really talking about? And that's why this issue of rights is important. So, we were joking about Jefferson cribbing lines from John Locke, who of course is writing in the 1670s, 1680s. Locke actually helps write one of the first constitutions for the Carolinas when it's being settled, right? So, there is this sort of continuity where there's already this discussion about natural rights and natural law and this idea that rights precede the government. Um, but the Declaration of Independence, right, the part that everybody skips over is that long list of grievances against George III.
Mhm.
Um, but in reading those, that's really where I think there's a lot of this rights talk ultimately derives from. And we can see the history of these conflicts because this is a very fast process. I mean, it's only 1763 that we start seeing conflicts between the Americans and British, the colonists in Britain, I should say. But there's that whole language is very much drawn from the experience of Britain the previous century, right, leading up to that glorious revolution in 1688, where Parliament finally asserts its power over the king, right?
Right. And you could really consider the American Revolution to be both forms of that word, in that we took that language and then we eliminated the king. So we did take the old template, but we made it into a different operating template, which I think is it's incredible, and it's obviously been an inspiration to the rest of the world. There's anyone who can tries to get here, and most of the countries of the world model themselves after us. So I think we performed both revolutions. And what's really cool to me is, at the time, the founders seemed to have understood just how momentous this was. And I want to read a quote from John Adams, and he wrote this to his wife on July 2nd, which was when the original independence was written, that draft. But it illustrates how excited they were, and just really predicts how this would play out in our country. So July 2nd, it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, and illuminations from one end of the continent to the other, from this time forward, forevermore. So, I mean, that is it's hard because it's like enshrined and it's a historical quote, and we're like, yeah, of course. But to be there in that moment and to believe in it so much, you had so much further to go. It's like, it could be 5, 10 years before England regroups and comes back and says, no, we're taking it back. He was so confident. And I think that is really remarkable.
Mm-hmm. And of course, just to lay out the history, because this came up a bit, because right now in celebrations this year, the Sons of the American Revolution have been pushing for these public readings, and they've identified July 8th. So people are like, we have July 2nd, July 4th, July 8th. What's going on? Well, July 2nd is actually when the initial draft text that the Committee of Five, right? I mean, we remember that it was John Adams, Ben Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson, with Jefferson doing most of the writing. But there's also two others, Roger Sherman and Robert Livingston, who are members of that committee. Sherman from Rhode Island or Connecticut, one of the two. He's actually interesting because he's the only person that signed the four great foundational documents, right? So he signs the original First Continental Congress decree. He signs the Declaration of Independence. He signs the Articles of Confederation, which was the first government the U.S. has, and then he signs the Constitution, right? So he's the only person that's there at all four major pivotal events in the early part of the country. Nobody remembers it. But yeah, July. Go on. What was that?
It had to have been annoying in some way for no one to mention him.
Well, I mean, he dies before these commemorations really kick off in the 19th century. Because one of the things that well, let me finish this. So July 2nd is when he introduced the draft. They debated for a couple of days. The final text is decided on July 4th, which is why we remember July 4th, right? Yeah. July 8th, it's publicly read, right? They sit on it for a couple of days, and printed copies are sent out. And then you did some research. It was August before they finally got around to signing the one that's in the National Archives, right?
Yeah. August 2nd was the date that all the representatives had signed. So, I mean, technically it was finalized on August 2nd, which make America a Leo instead of a Virgo.
Virgo or Cancer? Isn't Cancer before Leo?
Right. It's got to be Cancer, the one before that. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, so it's sort of, I mean, of course, 18th century. We did that episode with Metz and Pekin, and he was talking about, that political factions of parties made more sense in slower communications. That's part of what's going on. But again, they're already deep into a war. Their efforts to resolve the war aren't really working. In some ways, one of the things they're really up against is they're really stuck in a situation. And I think people tend to forget this, because we tend to see in this heroic thing that, everybody was for independence. It actually, these 13 colonies that existed really never had much in common before the experience of fighting against Britain in the 1760s after the French and Indian War. They were all established for different purposes. They all have different unique relationships with the British Crown or the British Parliament. Some are commercial colonies, some are religious colonies. Both Maryland and Pennsylvania are personal grants, right? So they really don't have a lot structurally in structure. Of course, there's some trade between them, but up until the 1760s, they see themselves as individually relating back to England,
Right.
right? It's really this process where they have to struggle after the French and Indian War because now Britain is bankrupt. Right. I mean, we tend to forget, but the French and Indian War, or what the Europeans refer to as the 7 Years' War,
Right.
is really one of the first global conflicts. I mean, Britain and France are fighting in India, they're fighting in North America, they're fighting in the Caribbean, they're fighting in Europe, and they both emerged from the war as largely bankrupt. Right.
Right.
And Britain now, to protect, Britain, of course, inherits the Canadian French colonies. Um,
Mhm.
but it's caught in a situation that now they have to keep the colonists from sparking a war with Native American tribes to the west. And that's what brings the British troops in and sparks the idea that somehow we're going to have to pay for this, right? And that's what sparks them in to start taxing, trying to figure out ways to tax the colonies.
Right. Right. And of course, we had no representation and we weren't having it, which, again, if you really think about it, just a bunch of people out in the middle of the wilderness being able to discern that their ruling power isn't treating them fairly and take a stand. That's really something, I
Well,
think.
and it takes a long time to develop, and that's one of the things that's been interesting to me in studying it over the years is that this was never really a process um, that took place at one time and everywhere across the colonies, right?
Right.
Even once fighting starts. I mean, when fighting breaks out in Massachusetts, the British are pretty much, or a number of people are convinced it's just those New England colonies being jerks, right? Let it dangle. But then British actions in 1775 in the South in Virginia, where the British are starting to offer, going back to the slave question, they're starting to offer slaves emancipation if they leave their masters and fight for Britain. And
Yeah.
Britain starts working with some of the Cherokee and Creek nations to raid the southern colonies. Over time, Britain starts creating this conflict where it becomes clear that it's the enemy of all the colonies, and that's pushing them together,
Hmm.
right? And the Declaration of Independence is sort of at the end of that process. But even when it's signed, the colonies are heavily split. Only about a third of the colonists are actually in favor of independence. A third are actually Tories. They support remaining part of England, and the other third are just trying to keep their heads down.
Right. Right.
So it's not even that common. Can I ask you a trivia question?
Okay. I'll
This
give
is
it a
this
try.
is interesting, and you know, this is leaving aside the Continental Congress, which is a representative. The colonies sent representatives to the Continental Congress. But do you know what the first shared national institution for the 13 United States actually was?
I'm going to have to say it was the military. Had to.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely right. The Continental Army. I mean,
Yeah.
this is the first institution that all these colonies share collectively together, right? And
Yeah.
that's one of the tragedies last year where we had the 250th anniversary of the Army that got conflated with Trump's birthday and gets conflated with the No Kings protest, right? Even though the celebration had been planned during the Biden administration,
Yeah.
right? But the Army really is the first institution that belongs to the United States of America as a nation,
Yeah.
right? Which is a fascinating dynamic, right?
I think that, to put yourself in that time and place, if you were a colonist and you were a male between, as early as age 14 up to age 60, if you were a male, you showed up to train in military exercises in your town, wherever you were. That was actually a normal way of life for the colonists and really did set us up to be able to become independent and actually fight a revolution. And the first breakout really happened when these British troops decided to go raid a farm store of weapons and ammunition. And the farmers came over and were like, what are you doing? And shots rang out. And I think Ralph Waldo Emerson named that the shot that was fired that was heard around the world.
Right. The shot heard around the world.
But it's so when we talk about the Second Amendment and why it's so important to us Americans, because without our ability to fight a war, we wouldn't be a country right now.
Right. And even the arguments about, we've had this over the last 2 or 3 years. Is the Second Amendment, does that guarantee an individual right to bear arms? Or people like the well-regulated militia argument that it's only in the context of a militia. Um, whatever. And so much of that's been structured by post-Revolutionary War history. But it does go back to this is a major sticking point. And in some ways, the colonies are a bit unique. Of course, the colonists had fought on the British side in the French and Indian War. This is where Washington, leading the retreat from Detroit, and that whole thing really puts him on the national stage. But back in England, one of the things that's going on in Europe over this period is and this idea of the militia sort of partially grows out of medieval levies, right? Where lords can call on the peasantry or the yeoman farmers to help defend the country. But in Britain, this is largely done away with by this point, right? They have professional troops, and that's what the Americans are starting to confront,
Yeah.
right? Is you have a militia versus professional troops, and this actually leads to problems because you have situations where the New Hampshire militia, for instance, right? They help drive the British out of Massachusetts or whatever, but then they go, why am I going to go down to defend Pennsylvania? That's not my territory,
Yeah.
right? And they go home for the winter and everything because they're a militia. So that's what sparks the need for a national army that's devoted to the nation as a whole, not to the individual states, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's really important. It always sounds so like you sound like one of those crazy mega people, but if you look at, say, Venezuela or Mexico or Iran, especially Iran, earlier this year, none of their citizens are armed, and between 30 and 40,000 citizens got hung for protesting. I don't think that would happen if they had weapons. I don't think Iran would be a country if their people had weapons. And the same when you look at these other countries like Venezuela, like the people aren't getting a dime of the oil revenues because the people in charge have guns and they don't. So it may sound like an outdated argument, but it's still very relevant today. We can see examples where unarmed citizens are constantly being violated and taken advantage of and over leveraged to people with guns.
Right, and remember that. So roughly by the end of the 1763, at the end of the French Revolution War, I think there's only like 10,000 British troops in North America. In 1763, there's still about 10,000 in 1775, where this starts going up. But one of the things that had changed, and it's interesting to look at the map, in 1763, those British troops, which hadn't been there before, I mean, it was very rare to see large numbers of British troops within the colonies, right? It just didn't happen. But they're largely concentrated in two places. They're concentrated in the new Canadian cities, right, that Britain inherits from the French or takes from the French. And a number of them are actually concentrated around the edges of the Iroquois nation, which is still an independent nation, but they're there to sort of keep the colonists and the Iroquois apart so they don't start fighting in what's now Western New York, Western Pennsylvania, that stuff. By 1775, if you look at the distribution of troops, they're almost all concentrated in Philadelphia and Boston now because of the problems that the colonists had generated. So,
Yeah.
so one of the things about this is not just that the troops exist, but over this sort of 12-year period, um, those troops actually become a bigger problem with cities, and the colonists start having to get focused on this for the first time.
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah, the military stuff is interesting, but yeah, and I think one of the things that strikes me as we go through these celebrations, like I've already said, is how astounding. You read that quote from Adams. How astounding those celebrations had been,
Yeah.
right? I mean, one of the things that strikes me is just some of the things in the 19th century. For instance, there's accounts during the Mormon Exodus from Illinois out to what becomes Salt Lake City. Even though there's been heated violence, right? This is after Joseph Smith's been killed. Heated violence between the U.S. government and the Mormons. They still stop on the trail during the Exodus, these trains, and celebrate July 4th.
Hmm.
During the Civil War, both sides celebrate July 4th, right? Even though it doesn't become a federal holiday in our modern sense to 1938.
Yeah.
It's heavily, heavily celebrated throughout the stuff, particularly after the War of 1812, right? Where, again, the U.S. has a battle with Britain, and this sort of revigorates a lot of these issues.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to remember these shifts in history and culture that we've made over time. It's been 6, 7, 8,000 years of pretty well documented history. We don't really know much beyond that, but from there, I mean, we had a very draconian time where if you messed up in society, you were pretty much ostracized and left to die. And then, we have some iterations where like Christians brought in this idea of forgiveness and kindness, and that really changed a lot of things and it birthed other countries. And then we have the shift when America comes onto the stage where it's like you can determine your own destiny as a human being. And I think it's really important to recognize these cultural shifts. Obviously, the Christian one's Christmas, and this next one is the 4th of July, where we become self determined people. I think it's really important to celebrate those moments because you can lose them. You're the historian. We can lose so easily.
Right. And I think there's something to bear in mind. And I'd like to go back to it because, the historian in me has one of the quotes you said is so many countries in the world have modeled themselves after the U.S. That's actually not true. There's only really been about 30 countries that have adopted a U.S. style constitution.
Well, I'm broader sense in terms of like the cultural impact of financial modeling, banking system, everything that we've created has been things that countries have adopted for the most.
Well, but one of the things I wanted to point out, though, is that the one thing that has been heavily imitated is not the system of government we end up with 13 years later. It is the concept of a Declaration of Independence as a starting point and a foundation.
Yeah.
Right? So we see between 1776 and particularly from about 1800 down to the 1820s, we see a whole range of particularly the New World countries, Latin America, Mexico, and whatnot, declaring independence. But we also have Greece in making itself independent from the Ottoman Empire and a couple others. That concept of independence, in that case, they are borrowing directly from the United States. The United States is the example. But even when you get to decolonization after the Second World War in particular, right, the strength and power of that American example, right, we even talk about it ourselves, right, that, who's the George Washington figure in this independence movement and that type of stuff. It becomes a touchstone in a way that the government of the U.S. never really becomes elsewhere in the world, right? And I think that is something worth noting in all this, is that the very idea of independence is in some ways much more powerful than the particular structure that it takes.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's a legacy we should be a lot more proud of because if you think about it, we went from a handful of empires ruling the planet to almost 200 independent countries at this point, and that
Right.
large part thanks to our example.
Right. Yeah. Not directly, but yeah.
I'm claiming it.
No. That's no. I think we should, because I really do think that this is something to bear in mind. Right. It's gotten the U.S. into some misadventures over the years, going all the way back. When Woodrow Wilson in the Versailles Treaty creates these independent countries in Europe that just can't defend themselves, Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia and these others that just but that basic idea is enshrining that, right? The ideas that are argued when the UN Charter set up in 45 and leads into the great debate. I mean, one of the great ironies that we tend to forget is in 1956, you have the U.S. and the Soviet Union uniting against Britain and France over the Suez Canal crisis about the independence of Egypt, is really what it's about. And boy, you want to talk about the old empires confronting the new Cold War powers. That was exactly what that conflict. So even within living memory of a lot of people around, these enduring qualities of independence continue.
Yeah, we have definitely broken down that old empirical structure and good for us, but now we have a whole new set of problems to confront. So it just goes to show that it is that, like you were saying earlier, being a human being in a human society is a continual work in progress. It always.
Yeah, it always continues, and I think that's one of the things that we would benefit reflecting on nationally. It's not just a celebration. There's nothing wrong with the celebration. I mean, for people who are critical of the U.S. now, it really is a huge achievement. It really is something worth celebrating.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of work to be done, and sometimes it takes going back to these original documents. And again, I point out because nobody actually likes to go through the list of grievances against George III, right? They're dull, they're dry, they're written in very bizarre language for modern ears.
What are you talking about? I go over my grievances against George every week.
Well, but this is something within those grievances are really these unalienable rights that are being talked about.
Mhm.
And looking through those and seeing where those still apply today. Do they apply? Don't they apply? Right? How some of them get embedded within the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, how others don't.
Yeah,
Right? I think is something that we probably need to reflect on a little bit. I mean, of course, we could talk about them historically, and this is one of the online discussions my students hated doing. Was I was like, okay, pick a couple of those charges and give me the historical. What are they pointing to?
yeah,
Right? What was the historical event that generated that? But in the broader sense, looking at that, and we go from this concept of unalienable rights that can't be taken from us, and where do we find those? And are actually quite detailed here within those charges against George III.
yeah.
Um, and it's worth considering, what all that means here now in the early part of the 21st century, or quarter way into the 21st century as we are now.
Yeah, I don't know if you had a kaleidoscope growing up as a kid. Did you ever have one of
Oh
those?
yeah.
And to me, the more I learn about human history, the more it just looks like a kaleidoscope to me. What's interesting is we did break away from a monarchy, but it seems to be that that same human apparatus still forms itself, even inside of a democracy. You see it in the form like oligarchies. And in our case, the new complaint on the left is the billionaires, right? But if you think about, and I love having billionaires, I actually think that that's a sign that we have a tremendous economy with a lot of freedom to invent and explore and expand. And the markets rewarded these people. So it's not like they just took it and they didn't earn it. So the markets rewarded them. So I think they're really great to have. But in a lot of ways, you could think of a billionaire almost like a monarch with the same types of power because they own entire distributions, and that can make it very difficult for anyone to be anything other than a subject.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like I said, it's never perfect, but it just seems like no matter what mechanism we put in, the same power structures arise.
Well, and that's, I mean, one of the interesting things is the monarchy debate. Now, of course, during the Constitutional Convention, there is some discussion. And everybody even assumed during the Constitutional Convention, the first executive officer of the U.S. was probably going to be Washington.
Yeah,
Should he be a king? So monarchy wasn't totally dead. And in fact, the European model is they still prefer the constitutional monarchies really up into the late 19th century
right.
to non-monarchical models. But one of the things that's interesting about how epic making that rejection of monarchy initially in the Declaration of Independence was, of course, one of the first great explorations of how much had changed in the U.S. since the Revolution was Washington Irving's Rip Van Winkle. Right, he goes to sleep, this magical extended sleep here when you have 13 colonies, and he wakes up right 30 some years later in what's now the United States. And part of that story is not just the entertainment of this guy taking a long nap and waking up, right, which gets picked up in Buck Rogers and everything else, but part of it is Washington Irving writing here in the 1820s as part of the Knickerbocker Tales, um, sort of thinking, okay, where have we come in almost 50 years? And one of the things that stands out is one of Rip Van Winkle's first experiences that he is not in the same world he was before is he goes to the local tavern after waking up, and he walks in. The first thing he notices is there's no picture of George III, the monarch, on the wall.
Yeah.
Right? The monarch's gone, and it immediately strikes him as something weird is going on here. Right?
Mhm.
But the fact that even in the 1820s, that would be such a powerful message. 50 years later, really indicates, I think, the power of the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah. And I've done a lot of thinking about how, you're always going to have a few people trying to hijack the system and take over. But really, all it needs is an informed citizen voting class, right? And that's something that I was reading through the founders' writings last night, and I remember one of them. I can't remember exactly who it was, but he talked about that the way they've set up everything with a balance of powers and having the checks in there that this country should stand and the Constitution should stand so long as we all have the same value system. And I thought that was very interesting because right now we're dealing with a ton of people in this country that don't necessarily share the same value system. And I'm not just talking about different colored people or different people from different countries. We even have white people in our group that want to go for Marxism and socialism. So even amongst white people, we don't really have as much of a shared value system anymore. And I do think that that might be our Achilles heel. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, well, I've got a bunch. So first of all, you're talking about the structure in the Constitution, of course, is 13 years in the making. They have to go through a failed form of government, the Articles of Confederation, which gives so much power to the states, they can't do anything, right? Once Great Britain's defeated, it's sort of like we don't want to have anything to do with you, and it just creates tons and tons of problems unless they do have some sort of shared interest, which is like distribution of the Western lands that they get from Great Britain. They come together to work on that, but they don't, taxes and should you have state churches and all this other stuff hasn't been worked out yet. But that said, I think a couple things within the Declaration really point to this. So one, of course, I just talked about those list of grievances against George III, which can really enlighten to what they think unalienable rights are.
Mhm.
But what's interesting is everybody reads the first part. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal and are endowed with their creator by unalienable rights. Chief among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? But if you read the rest of that long paragraph, one of the things that they point out very openly is like, look, we feel collectively that it's our obligation to explain why we think those rights aren't being respected. So from the get-go, it's not only just an educated citizenry, but it's an idea of what we would consider now transparency and openness,
Yeah.
right? That we have to make the argument. And of course, this is an Enlightenment idea. But they feel compelled as part of this to make this very public statement um, of that we have to talk to an educated citizenry. Now, you talk about differences, Marxism, socially. Of course, Marxism doesn't exist in this period. But one of the favorite stories you actually came across in doing some research for this episode, right, was what happens with Adams and Jefferson,
Yes.
right? So both of these, and of course, Jefferson is not involved with the Constitution at all. He's still serving as ambassador to France, right? But Adams and Jefferson get into this huge dispute in the 1790s, largely from the Alien and Sedition Acts that comes close to tearing the country apart. Um, and then they don't talk to each other
Mm-hmm.
for well over a decade. And then sometime after Jefferson's presidency ends in 1809, there's conflicting stories, but what it seems is one of their wives sort of nudges them and like, why don't you send a birthday card or something like that to them? But then Adams and Jefferson engage in this 13, 14-year-old correspondence
Yeah.
back and forth, where they're basically arguing exactly what you identify, right? Adams promoted a much more sort of English, almost oligarchic view of the U.S. Jefferson representing something that was new and different that owed far more to what at least theoretically emerges in the best aspects of the French Revolution. And they have this extensive debate. So this idea that people, Americans somehow all agreed on their values wasn't the case. And then I'll let you tell the end of the story, which is so fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, those two were pretty close. It's quite an amazing relationship. And I was amazed when I found out that they both died on the same day, 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th. So they both July 4th, the same day.
And supposedly, I think it was Adams' last words when he passes. I might get this backwards, but Adams' last words are supposedly at least the country still has Jefferson, not
Ah,
realizing that Jefferson had died about 3 hours before that.
gosh.
Right, but it is a powerful, powerful message. Again, that dispute between Adams and Jefferson's bitter,
Yeah.
incredibly bitter. But they come back together, and the mid 1820s are marking a shift, right?
Mhm.
Adams and Jefferson pass away. John Quincy Adams, John Adams' son, is president, but he's the last of what we sometimes call the notable presidents. He's really the last president that was old enough to remember the debates around the Revolution and leading into it. Of course, he lives into the 1840s, but it's still it's still a change, right? That's going on. And Adams and Jefferson mark a passing. And I think that's one of the reasons. If I had to think, I would think that July 4th starts being celebrated much more consciously and broadly in the 1820s, and partially because they know they're losing these people.
Right, right. Um, there was a third that died on July 4th, Madison.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah. And of course, Madison had played a key role in the Constitutional Convention, the Federalist Papers, right? He was a little younger during the Revolution, but still very much part of that generation, right?
yeah,
And so I think in some ways, looking back on it, a lot to celebrate over 250 years. Certainly, they didn't. Neither the Constitution or the Declaration fix anything, right?
hmm,
Slavery is probably the big one. And I tend to think the debates about slavery and the Declaration of Independence is very similar to what they later become during the Constitution. That is, it's a contentious issue. It's an issue that you have a large number of people, and almost all of them are figuring slavery's on its way out, right?
yeah.
And that it doesn't have a viable future, but there's such a vested interest in it. And I don't buy the 1619 argument that it's the purpose for the revolution or it's the purpose for the Constitution. I think what happens is it's one of these issues that, unfortunately, and I'm not saying this is right, but I think the people at the time look at it as like, look, this is an important issue, but it's not important enough to wreck the larger project. So we'll kick the can down the road.
Yeah. Well, the idea that they were, I mean, if you put yourself in the mindset of a colonist, you're just trying to survive the day every day. You're not necessarily contemplating higher ideals. You're trying to survive, you know?
Well, I think the Declaration is in a context where people are exactly thinking of those higher ideas.
I think the writers were, but your average colonist was just trying to survive.
Well, but your average colonist, I mean, of course, it depends where you are, but a lot of the average colonists have already engaged in some of this stuff through the corresponding societies that emerged in the
Yeah.
1760s,
Yeah.
talking about where the British are wrong. They're certainly riled up by the broadsheets. They certainly get caught up in the conflict once it starts, right, and spreads.
In reading about a lot of the events leading up to the Revolutionary War, those colonists, they really remind me of a lot of rural Nevadans. It's types of fundamental conversations, and in a lot of ways the same, almost the same type of lifestyle. It's very rugged. You have to think through everything. It's not always easy to get to a store or to have any services. So a lot of those, it really does remind me of rural Nevada, and it's kind of cool because I could see in the colonists the same people alive today, which is incredible.
Well, and I think that leaves a lot of, of course, as we're recording this, the 2026 World Cup is going on. And one of the things that's emerged out of the World Cup is particularly European visitors coming here and just being shocked that the U.S. doesn't look like how the media reports it back there.
Yeah, they're having a good time.
Yeah, they're having a great time. But part of what's so interesting about it is that I think that colonial, that frontier spirit, whatever you want to call it, comes through with this very sort of independent spirit, in the sense that, okay, I have to take care of myself. There's stuff I want to do. And, I would argue that part of where we're caught right now at the 250th anniversary is embarking on another debate over how, what is the limit of that independence versus a centralized state, right?
Yeah.
Now, some aspects, the questions such as the freedom of speech that's being curtailed, the economic issues about taxes, right? There's some parallels, but I think there's also some bigger parallels to get right back to, I think there would be plenty of people that say, like London in the 1770s, does Washington, D.C. actually know what's going out here in rural Nevada, right?
No.
Did they know the problems? Did they know that efforts to stop? I mean, again, one of the big things is I put those troops out that the British have. What the British are trying to do is keep the colonists who have a deep land hunger, right, from expanding into Native American lands. And that's why the troops are originally deployed, is as part of that. And that's part of the thing that sparks some of these disputes. And I think we're seeing that today when Washington's coming in. Okay, Las Vegas can't grow because the federal government doesn't want to release the land. That's a powerful echo,
Yeah.
right? Or, one of the issues that came up as well, one of the charges against George III, there's one that sort of hints, well, you're enforcing sort of Anglican religion on the U.S. colonies, but you're letting the French colonists keep their religion and their legal practices that they've inherited for France. That's fundamentally unfair, right? And I think, if we look at some of these DEI debates, we see echoes of that argument, right? Why is it okay for this group to be able to practice stuff their way, but not okay for this group to do so, right? A lot of these issues still bedevil us to an extent. I'm not saying there's going to be a new American Revolution or Civil War, but I think part of the strength of the original Declaration of Independence is recognizing that's how important some of these fundamental issues are and continue to be, and we need to reflect that we still have a lot of work to do to resolve these. It's going to be a continual process.
Well, and it's a lot of work to take responsibility for yourself, and being a self-determined human being is very difficult. Going back to your FIFA example, I think that's a lot of what the Europeans were experiencing, because I know we don't think of socialism as the same type of a deal as monarchy, but to me it is in one very specific way. You're subject to something other than you. And so European countries tend to be more socialist. They're used to giving up most of their pay to other people and the greater good. And then you come here, and the two things that really cracked me up about the Europeans were their obsession with ranch dressing and, and free refills. Like, they could not believe that you get free refills. And I'm just like, okay. But it's kind of peels back the layer of what it looks like to be a person who lives in a socialist society. You become a person who is very locked in, and any kind of liberty is super exciting because you're like, oh my gosh, they don't let us do this back home. We should really hold on to that.
Right. Well, and it gets into questions of abundance. And one of the things that's always surprising about that generation of Americans is that they're significantly larger than Europeans, right? Because they have access to the protein in much larger quantities. So, Jefferson's 6'4", Washington's 6'2", and about 225 pounds. So he's big. When the average height of Europe's 5'6", 5'7", right?
Yeah.
So there's already a marked distinction of abundance, but it is sort of an interesting thing to reflect on as well. And just to finish off on the FIFA example, the thing that's so interesting about it is, of course, these Europeans are in different cities across the United States, right? Because of how they have the team. So Boston, there was a great joke in the game where England was playing against Scotland, because I think they're both in Massachusetts and Boston as sort of their playing cities, and England lost the match. And one of the commenters, like, the English have always struggled in Massachusetts, which is great. But the fact that the Scottish tourists that have fallen in love with Boston, and Norwegians in New York, and the Japanese down in Houston, and people in other things, the fact that they're actually in these various separate states with their separate individual cultures that Americans recognize, and they're actually seeing these commonalities, I think ultimately goes back to, probably an expression of the dream embodied within the Declaration of Independence, that these United States, that whatever our differences, stand on certain principles. And I think we're seeing that played out, which is fascinating in its own right.
Yeah, it's fascinating that it played out through FIFA. It couldn't have come at a better time. I'm just relieved that it happened, because we were talking about this earlier in the week, that it's great that they're celebrating and they're so excited about America, but it also, on the other hand, it really implies that global media is not covering us very well, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a topic for another episode. But
Right.
but no, this is
reminded people that we are a great country, and they saw it for themselves. It's a good time for that to happen.
And I think it's good for Americans to see others responding that way, and seeing how unique it is. So, well, for those of you who are going to be celebrating here on July 4th, 2026 for the 250th, please be safe, right? Out here in the 775, we've already got some problems because it was such a dry winter with fire. So, we're going to be watching closely, but, do celebrate. And do think, one of the things I think we want to do with this show is encourage people to stay involved with the political and cultural activities, right? To continue to be involved in the community, because that's how change actually happens. If you have a question for Crystal and I, go ahead and shoot us an email at info@775alive.com, and we'll do our best to get back to you in a timely manner. But until then, and on to the other side of the July 4th holiday, I'm Scott Gaborski.
And I'm Crystal Newton.
And we'll see you around the 775.